It's a pleasure to introduce our last speaker. He's a cell biologist whose interests developed into the bridging of science and spirituality. He's a common speaker on television and radio. Please welcome Dr. Bruce Lipton.
Good afternoon. Today I'd like to talk about the science of how you create your life and then deal with a more important question, and that is, if you are creating your life, then how did you end up with a life that you have? And I'll do this from a scientific perspective because I have to start with a big event that occurred in 1953. In 1953, a paper by James Watson and Francis Crick shook the entire scientific world because they provided us an understanding of the nature of the DNA double helix and how the DNA serves as the genetic code in our system. 5 years later, Francis Crick extended his information and published a paper, a hypothesis, that is officially called the central dogma. And as I have it illustrated right here in this slide, the central dogma is the equivalent of the 10 Commandments of biomedicine today. And what the central dogma states is that information in biology flows from DNA, which is the equivalent of a molecular blueprint, to RNA, which is the equivalent of a Xerox of the DNA, and that information in the RNA is then later translated into protein. The significance of the protein is that your body is physically made out of proteins and your behaviors come from your proteins. So the significance about this is that the proteins that create our lives are ultimately derived apparently from the DNA. But what Francis Crick added to his hypothesis was a very important point. He said that information only flows in one direction, so the information flows from the DNA to the RNA and then to the protein. You say, well, what's relevant about that? And the answer is this: you are the protein. Your life is the protein. And the significance of this information flow says that you and your life can no way go back and influence your heredity and your DNA. So basically, we come to a big conclusion from this understanding that says your life is actually controlled by your genes. So we understand this characteristic as called the primacy of DNA, that DNA is responsible for the characteristics in your life. Well, the significance of this is extended in the next picture right here, which is a cover of Life magazine, and the cover story is, "Were you born that way?" And the significance of the story is dealing with a concept that was derived from Francis Crick, and the concept is called genetic determinism. And basically what this says is as follows. It says that at the moment of conception, that the genes from your mother and the genes from your father come together in the conceptus, and then from these genes are selected the genes that will actually manifest through your life. Since the DNA is responsible for the proteins, and then the proteins give you your characteristics, then according to this story, your fate is essentially predetermined at the moment of conception, because your characteristics, considering your physical characteristics, your behavioral characteristics, your emotional characteristics, are apparently pre-programmed in your genes. So basically it says at that moment of fertilization, then the characteristics of your life are laid out before you, even long before you were born. The significance of genetic determinism also adds another component to our lives. And it says this: as far as we know, we didn't pick the genes that we came with. That, according to the hypothesis, we cannot change the genes that we came with. And according to current science today, even if we don't like our traits, we cannot just genetically engineer all new genes into our body. So basically it says the genes control your life and you have no influence over them. That all of a sudden creates the concept of you being a victim of your heredity, so that if there's dysfunction or disease running in your family, then you might count on that showing up in your life if you were the recipient of those genes from your parents during that moment of conception. Well, the problem with being a victim is this: once you buy the nature of victim, then you also buy the concept of irresponsibility. Well, if I can't do anything about it, then why should I even care? Furthermore, if you buy into the nature of victim, then you also buy into the need for a rescuer. So consequently, we end up with something like the pharmaceutical industry that says, we're here to serve you, to cover up for your frail genetics and the vulnerable biology that you are. So we are a victim, and we buy a rescuer to help us out with this understanding. Well, the significance of all this is really based on the concept that genes control our lives. And the significance about that in cell biology is that inside the cell, there's a large organelle, a large structure called the nucleus, and the nucleus is a repository for almost all of the genes in the cell. And the significance of that is then science looks at the nucleus and says that the nucleus represents a structure in the cell that controls the function and its behavior and expression. Many textbooks just come right out and say the nucleus is equal to the cell's brain. Well, there's a problem with this hypothesis, and it's based on this. If you take any living organism and you remove the brain from it, the immediate consequence of that action is that the organism dies. However, if you take a cell and remove a nucleus from the cell, it's a process called enucleation, something I used to do a lot in my own research. What will happen is something very strange. The cell does not die. In fact, the cell lives and its behavior is totally unaffected. Many cells can live for 2 or more months with absolutely no genes, and the nucleus is gone as well. But these cells are carrying out very complex behavioral repertoires and sustaining their lives. So basically it says that somewhere in the cell, something is coordinating the functions of the cell, and that would be the equivalent of the brain. But these are enucleated cells. So we come to a very interesting conclusion that the nucleus does not necessarily represent the brain at all. So all of a sudden we buy into a belief that we are controlled by these genes, and then it turns out maybe we're not. The question might then come up and say, well, then what's the function of the nucleus? It's one of the biggest structures in the cell. And the answer is this. The nucleus contains the genes. The genes are the blueprints to create the proteins that give you your physical traits and your characteristic. So basically, when do you need the genes? It's when you want to reproduce the proteins or reproduce the cell. So the significance is the nucleus is not the brain of the cell. The nucleus is the gonad of the cell. And the significance of that is science is a male-dominated profession, and since males apparently think with their gonads, then making the nucleus the brain of the cell makes sense in that regard. However, we're left with one undeniable fact, and this is a fact. A gene is a blueprint. And the significance of gene being a blueprint is a very simple understanding. There is no such thing as an on blueprint and an off blueprint. So when we talk about the concept that a gene turns on and a gene turns off, which you read about and hear about all the time, this is a total fabrication. It is a myth. The simple reason is this. Genes are not self-actualizing. Genes cannot turn themselves on and control their own behavior. So if genes can't even control themselves, then the concept that they control your life is totally misleading. So we lead with a very important fact. Genes do not control biology. Well, then all of a sudden we're left with a big question, then what does control biology? Well, I had an opportunity to get great insights into this over 40 years ago when I was cloning stem cells. And I was in this experiment taking stem cells out of an organism and then putting them into tissue culture. All of you have stem cells in your body right now. And stem cells are the equivalent of embryonic cells that didn't differentiate or take a specific fate. They're embryonic cells running through your body. What are they relevant for? And the answer is that they replace the cells that you lose from normal attrition. Every day you lose billions of your cells, and you must replace them, and the stem cells are the source of the replacement cells. Stem cells also function in repairing damaged and dysfunctional tissues and organs. So basically, what was my research all about? Well, what I did was I isolate a single stem cell, and I put one stem cell in a culture dish, and that stem cell would then divide every 10 hours. And after a couple of days, 3 days, 4 days, a week to 10 days, I end up with thousands of cells in the Petri dish. And you say, well, that's really nice. I say, yeah, but there's something very important about it. The fact is this, every cell is genetically identical because they came from the same parent cell. So basically, I have all these identical cells. And here's where the experiment comes in. I go to this Petri dish, remove some of the cells, and put it into another Petri dish where I have a different growth medium or nutrient medium. The growth medium is the environment for the cell. The cells live in growth medium. So I take the cells from this dish, some of them, put them in another dish with environment A, let's call it, and the cells form muscle. And then I say, wait. I go back to the same stem cell dish, take some more of those original stem cells, put them yet in another Petri dish with a different environment, environment B, and those cells form bone. And I say, no, wait. Go back to the same stem cell dish, take some of those cells out, put it in a third Petri dish with environment C, and then what happens is the cells form fat. Now, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to answer this question. What is it that controls the fate of the cells? The environment controls the fate of the cells. So what's really interesting is all of a sudden we're moving away that you are controlled by your genes, you're controlled by your environment. And then I take this understanding of the environment. I said, well, how does the environment actually control the cell? So my research led me into looking at the cells in tissue culture, and what I recognized is a simple fact, that when I added new chemicals and changed the environment of the cells, the chemistry comes into the culture dish, the chemicals land on top of the cells, some of the chemicals attach to the cells, and these chemicals become what are called signals. They cause the cell to activate very specific behaviors. Some of these signals actually go into the nucleus and activate the reading of very specific genes. So the understanding is this, that the cell is actually controlled by its skin. And the reason why is the skin is the interface between the external environment and the internal environment. And at that interface, then, the cell membrane actually translates the environmental signals into biological behaviors. So the brain of the cell is actually the membrane or skin of the cell. And this is very interesting because in human embryology, I would say, where do your nervous system, your brain, come from? And the answer is, it comes from your skin. So cells and people are very much alike in this same understanding right here. So how does it work? Well, here's how it works. Built into the cell membrane are switches, molecular switches. Now, there may be 50,000 switches in a cell, but they basically all have the same basic structure and organization. It consists of two proteins built into the membrane. One protein is called a receptor, and obviously what you think a receptor does is it receives information. You and your skin also have receptors, eyes, ears, nose, taste, touch. You're reading the environment with it. So does the cell read the environment with its receptors. When the receptor responds to an environmental signal, it activates the effector, the second protein. The effector protein has another function. When activated, the effector protein sends a signal into the cell to control the behavior or the genetics of the cell. So how does it work? Well, basically, I have to connect the two together. And in connecting the two together, what we find is this, is there a protein, a green one called a processor protein. The shape of it doesn't match the receptor, so I can't connect them. But when a signal comes from the environment, the protein changes shape, it connects one to the other, the effector then sends a signal into the cell. And as long as the signal is present, the switch is active. But when the signal goes away, the switch stops, and there's no more function until another signal comes up and then reconnects the switch and sends the signal in. The name of the switch in science talk is a receptor-effector integral membrane protein complex, and all of you are very excited. But I will just tell you this. I can define it in another way. I can give you a functional definition. The function of the receptor is awareness of the environment. That's what your eyes, ears, nose, etc. do as well. The function of the effector protein is, however, to send a physical sensation or signal into the cell and control the functions of the cell. So when you look in the dictionary, there's actually a word that says an awareness of the environment through a physical sensation, and that term is called perception. So the nature of the cell membrane is that it contains these switches called perceptions that respond to the environment and control the behavior of the cell. Well, this I understood about 30 or so years ago, and now recently in new textbooks they have images like this. And these are images that show the communication of signals going from the cell membrane through the cell and activating different functions. This new science is called signal transduction. Basically, it says, how does an environmental signal translate into a biological response? Well, to illustrate it, a receptor can pick up a signal from the environment. Then the switch sends a signal into the cell, and it goes from one set of proteins to another set of proteins, activating the proteins along the way, and those proteins, when active, create the behaviors of the cell. So a signal from the environment elicits behavior of the cell's functions interiorly. But sometimes the environmental signals are passed from the proteins in the cytoplasm and go into the nucleus. And when they go into the nucleus, these signals engage with the chromosomes and then select very specific genes to activate for the cell in response to the environmental signals. Well, what's really interesting about all this is a concept called epigenetic control. This is a new understanding of science. What you learned in school was something called genetic control, which simply says control by genes. But epigenetic control, the new science, which actually replaces genetic control, epi means above. So when I say epigenetic control, what I'm saying is control above the genes. And now what we're recognizing is that the environmental signals can actually manifest the control of genetic activity, and this supersedes the belief that genes are controlling themselves. More interesting is this: not only does epigenetic control activate genes, but environmental signals can modify the readout of your own genes. So basically, here's a very blow-away fact. Using epigenetic mechanisms, environmental signals can cause one gene to be read in such a way that it will create 30,000 different variations from that one gene. So basically, it says every gene in your body can be modified up to 30,000 different variations. Your genes are not fixed and static. The output of your genes are modifiable by the environment. You have a plastic system. You can take healthy genes and make them sick genes, or you can take mutant genes and make them healthy genes through this concept called epigenetic control. And then I said, well, here's what's important about my story. My cells are in a plastic petri dish, and what I know is the environment controls the fate of the cells. So I take my dish, move it from a healthy environment, put it into a negative environment, and guess what happens? The cells get sick. And then all of a sudden I say, wow, well, how do you make the cells well again? Give them drugs? And the answer is absolutely not. You want to make the cells well, you take them from the bad environment and return them to the good environment, and the cells will automatically get well without any drugs. But the issue about this is, how does this relate to you? And the answer is this: when you look in the mirror and see yourself, guess what? You perceive yourself as one single individual. However, the simple reality is this: you are not a single individual. You are made out of about 50 trillion cells. And the significance of that is that you are a community, not a single thing. And in fact, you are a skin-covered petri dish. And if you take your skin-covered dish to a good environment, it'll stay healthy. And if you take your skin-covered dish to a bad environment, it's the same as the plastic culture dish. It's exactly the same. You will get sick. How do you get well? No drugs. Go back into the good environment. But the significance of all this really relates to, what is the culture medium of the cells in your body? And the answer is, it's the blood. So the blood is the same as my culture medium. The constituents of the blood control the behavior and the genetics of the cells in your body. But then what controls the composition of the blood? The answer is this: you respond to environmental signals, external and internal signals in your life. And you respond by your brain picking it up in a process called perception. Now, as you perceive an environmental signal, what happens is the mind kicks in and interprets that signal. And when the mind interprets the signal, it then causes the brain to release certain chemicals into the blood to change the culture environment, to adjust the cells to respond to the environment. So as you respond to what's going on in the world, you're changing the composition of your culture medium and affecting the behavior and genetics of your own cells. So essentially, all of you are cell biologists. Actually, more likely, self-biologists. And it works for this reason: your brain, through the function of your mind, releases chemistry into the blood. So when your mind is in a state of love, a perception of love, you release into your blood elements such as oxytocin, serotonin, and growth hormones, and these elements cause the cells to grow and maintain themselves and to flourish and do very well. In contrast, if you have a perception of fear in your life, then you start to release different chemicals such as cortisol, norepinephrine, and histamine. And what do? They shut down the growth processes, they actually inhibit the immune system, and they get you ready for a fight-or-flight protection posture. So as you activate your mind, you change the composition of the blood. But there's two parts to the mind. There's a conscious mind, which is associated with an add-on in the front of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. Most of the rest of the brain behind it actually constitutes what is called the subconscious mind. They have primarily different functions. The conscious mind is the seat of your identity. It's your source. It's your seat of your spirit. You talk about yourself, you're talking with the conscious mind. The function of the conscious mind is creative. And why is that relevant? Because your wishes, your desires, what you want from life, your aspirations, are from the creation of your conscious wishes and desires. In contrast, it's also the source of positive thinking. In contrast, the subconscious mind is a report playback mechanism with nobody in it. And that's why it's difficult to talk to your subconscious mind and have it do anything, because there's nobody in there in the first place. Its function is primarily habitual. It stores learned programs, and then at the push of the button can play those programs. These programs include instincts and experiences. The significance about that, we also have acquired programs, how we learn to deal with life. And the issue why that becomes important is because there are two different aspects to the function here. The conscious mind is a small processor. It can process only about 40 nerve impulses per second. The other subconscious mind processes 40 million nerve impulses per second. Your conscious mind and your subconscious mind are different. Your subconscious mind is 1 million times more powerful than your conscious mind. Where do the programs come from? And the answer is this: you can't have consciousness until you have programs. So the first 6 years of your life, you're in a state of brain activity called theta and delta, which is hypnosis. So the first 6 years of a child's life, it's just downloading everything it observes and putting that into the database inside of the subconscious mind. And then at age 6, a child begins to have consciousness because it has data that it can use to be conscious with. And by age 12, it ramps up and has another level of activity called beta, which is focused schoolroom kind of consciousness. The relevance about all this is very important. The learning experience the first 6 years teaches you the rules of enculturation, what you need to live in the world, and it also provides you with self-identity. What do you believe about yourself? And you hear that from parents, such as you're a smart kid, you're a beautiful kid, you don't deserve things, who do you think you are, you're a sickly child. They become programs. The relevance about all this is that we believe we are running our lives with our conscious mind. And it turns out that we are only running our lives about 5% of the time with our conscious mind. That 95% of our life is controlled by the subconscious mind. The significance of that is very important. This is the side which has the life that you want to create. This is the brain or part of the mind that is creating your life. The most important understanding? The fundamental belief programs that you have in there came from other people. So the conclusion becomes very important. It says, while you think you are creating your life with your conscious mind, you're invisibly actually running your life with the subconscious, the invisible behavior, and most of those programs came from other people. So you're actually living other people's lives, and while you're in your conscious mind figuring out why doesn't life work, you're invisibly shooting yourself in the foot. If I can just have 30 seconds more, I'll just end it with this way. You're infrequently ever aware of the subconscious behavior, and I'll give you a simple story to account for that. You know a friend, a close friend, you know your friend's parent. At some point, you recognize that your friend has the same behavior as their parent. So one day, you casually volunteer. You know Bill, you're just like your dad. Back away from Bill. But the joke about it is very profound in this regard. Everyone else can see that Bill behaves like his dad. It's only Bill who doesn't see it. But that's a lesson for all of us. Why? All of us are doing the exact same thing as Bill, and then trying to figure out why our life isn't working out the way it is, when it turns out, because invisibly, we're sabotaging or limiting or disempowering ourselves with the kind of programs we received when we were less than 6 years of age. Now, this would be a nightmare if I concluded this way, but I'll just add one last thing. Fortunately, the world has provided us with a whole series of new modalities to actually rewrite these programs in the subconscious mind very rapidly. And if you understand about this whole mechanism and then go in and rewrite the programs, then guess what? You will be able to automatically create your life with programs that will take you to the top when you're not even paying attention. And when you do that, you become the master and creator of the life that you want, and it doesn't even take any exercise. Why? It's all automatic behavior in the subconscious. So basically it says we must free ourselves, but you must first recognize you've been sabotaging yourself with subconscious programs derived from other people. We are more powerful than that. We can rewrite those programs and manifest virtually anything we want on this planet. And to do that, we must wake up from the matrix, take the red pill, and let go of the programming that has held us back, and create the new world that all of you have come here to manifest and to see. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.